Greetings to everyone out there in pipe smoking community of YouTube. I meant to get to this video earlier today when I recorded a thank you to Hobbit and Piper for his suggestion of the Shire Cobbett corncob pipe and some McBaron vanilla, but got busy and a little bit later in the evening. Anyways, I'm smoking this evening my Peterson bent. I was able to pick that up a couple of years ago when I had a chance to visit Peterson Pipe Shop. That was one of the highlights of my life. Great people, very helpful. Um, they called it a second. They said they have there was something that was kind of wrong with it. I can't find it. Being a rusticated pipe, that kind of hides some of the flaws. So I thought, well, if I can pick up a Peterson pipe that looks as pretty as this for $50, I'm definitely going to do that. So I'm smoking something new, at least to me. I've seen it around a lot. 7Cs. This is the blue tin, the Royal Blend. Has a nice room note. Um, according to the back, brown Virginias, brown Burleys, or golden Virginias, I'm sorry, brown Burleys, and just a touch of Cavendish. Easy to fill your pipes. When you light it, you're met with a gentle sweetness with notes of vanilla, honey, together with slight fruit notes. I can definitely taste a little bit of the fruit, vanilla. I haven't gotten the honey yet, but I did think it was a gorgeous tin. For no other reason, I bought it just for that. Beautiful tin. It'll look good on the shelf. When I'm done with it, I'll have to put something else in it. I'm not sure what, but it comes well packed, as you can see. It is this tin. There's a lot of tobacco in there. It's a ribbon cut, but it smells delicious in the tin. If I knew any better, I'd probably try and eat some of it, but that may not be the best experience. Anyways, as I mentioned in my last video, I wanted to share a story with you. And as you know, the name of my channel, I think for some it may be a little confusing as to what mythical history is. I've heard people talk about mythic history. Really refers to kind of historical fantasy. Fantasy that's not way out, even though, you know, swords and elves and dwarves and things like that. I enjoy that as much as anyone else. Conan, I've read most of the series of his in the Hyborian Age. But even that, I guess I've always liked fantasy, but I like history as well, especially ancient history. And I kind of like not just the myth, the legend, the lore, but I like where all of that history kind of meets with real history. And some may say, well, I don't see where the crossover is. But you take, for example, Conan. I mean, a lot of that is Conan is the Cimmerian. Well, there was the actual Cimmerians that we had in history. Lived in the Mediterranean, the area of the Levant, and some believe that was one of the earliest civilizations, kind of compared to Egypt. There's a fight for those two. But I like where history and, you know, especially fantasy that's kind of based on history. I mean, one of the things you read about in Tolkien is that Tolkien wrote the Hobbit and mainly the Lord of the Rings, his mythology, kind of as a a historical background for England. I mean, it wasn't meant to be true, but it was meant to kind of provide somewhat of a that myth, legend, lore, bringing in King Arthur. King Arthur, the Arthurian tales were a big part of what influenced people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and others that were part of the Inklings, and I'm sure many other writers. But in my readings, I've come across a lot of stories in ancient history um, that I've really enjoyed, and I find them to be just as interesting as some of the fantasy literature that I've had a chance to read. One of the stories that, or at least a story I'd like to share with you today, comes from a book, and you may be familiar with the book of Daniel that's actually in the Old Testament. It's the book that goes back to quite a few years to the fourth, fifth century. I think around 500, maybe 550 when it was written. It's a story about the last king of Babylon, and you read the story in the Bible, the Old Testament, but you don't get all of the background to it. And I think the background that surrounds it, what we found in archaeology, actually adds so much more to that particular story. Now, the story occurs in Daniel chapter 5. And as I said, it's about the last king of Babylon. His name was Belshazzar. Um, Belshazzar was throwing a party. Things were going well, it seems, for him. And he thought, hey, let me throw a party. He invited about 1,000 people to this party of nobles and ladies and people that were in people of influence that were there in Babylon. And things were going well. People drinking the wine. He thought it tasted so good that he came up with a great idea, at least in his mind. He said, why don't we drink this wine out of the pots or the vessels that we took from, or at least one of his predecessors took from Jerusalem. There was a big temple that was there. That was the first temple that the Jews had made where they worshiped the Lord. And he thought it would be a good idea to let's go get those things out of the treasury and we'll drink and we'll party and we'll just have a good time. Well, as he would come to find out, that wasn't really the best idea. Seems Lord didn't really appreciate that too much, at least in the story that Daniel tells. In fact, as they began to drink from these vessels, it says that all of a sudden, and you're probably familiar with this part of the story, it's very famous about the handwriting on the wall. In fact, we use that expression today. People can't see the handwriting on the wall. Well, it says that while they were drinking, that all of a sudden fingers appeared as of a hand and began to write on the wall. Now, this just scared Belshazzar to death. Talked about how he kind of turned pale. It says his knees knocked, and there's a phrase that says that his limbs went loose. Now, that's actually a Hebrew idiom, kind of a phrase at that time. It didn't mean that he just was weak at the knees, though he would have been. And you probably have experienced it if you ever got afraid of something, you just feel like the energy, everything gets zapped out of you. Well, it wasn't just that, because to have your limbs go loose was a euphemism for basically having a bowel movement. So in front of the 1,000 people that were kind of the leaders and shakers of the day, people that he was trying to impress, he basically pooped his britches. And that in itself would have been embarrassing. You don't really get that out of the translations we have today, but that really is what the Hebrew translates into. Well, it seems he kind of collected himself. And again, according to Daniel, he kind of got in his right mind, and I guess he got himself cleaned up. And he said, what does this say? What is it? What are the words that were written on the wall? What do they mean? Because no one there could read them. Now, there were 4 words: mini, mini, tekel, farson, or parson. Some translation will put it eufarson, and it's the same word, but mini, mini, tekel, parson. Now, no one of all the people that were there, Babylonian, they, of course, they read cuneiform. And much like the Sumerians, much like the Assyrians before them, and much like the Babylonians of the day, um, cuneiform was a big language. Much of the stuff, much of the business and the writings and things were written in cuneiform. Although they did use other day-to-day typewriting, but that was what they really read. No one could read this, so he said, "Well, let me sweeten the pot here." And he said, "I'm going to make whoever can read, interpret this message of this handwriting on the wall that just appeared miraculously. I will make that individual third highest in the kingdom." Now that kind of sounds odd. You would think if it was really important to him, he would make him second. Maybe he was just waiting to see if anyone would step up, and he could even sweeten the deal and say, "Okay, instead of third, I'll make you second." But he stuck with that. He said, "I will make the person who can interpret this third highest in the kingdom." Now, it seems that there was a lady who was at this particular soiree, and she said, there was a man here that was around back in Nebuchadnezzar's day when we actually took these vessels, destroyed Jerusalem, and took the vessels from the temple. He was known for interpreting dreams. He interpreted a dream by Nebuchadnezzar, and maybe he can do the same thing here. So Belshazzar had some of his servants, or maybe the same ones that went to get the vessels, to go and get Daniel. And he said, they brought Daniel to him and said, "Daniel, I'll make you third highest in the kingdom. I'll give you all these different things, put a robe on you and everything." He said, "If you can interpret this for me." Daniel said, "Did you keep your money and keep your interpretation?" He says, "But he said, the God that I serve," he says, "he will give me the interpretation." He said, "I will be able to read this." And he said, what these words translate into, many tekel parson. It says, it's a kind of a phrase you hear in the medieval period too, and you can even hear it today. And that is, you have been weighed, you have been numbered, and you have been found wanting. Daniel proclaims, he says, as such, he says, the kingdom is now taken from you and will be given to the Medes and the Persians. And the Medes and the Persians was the kingdom that would rise up after Babylon. And it started out mainly as the Medes, although the Persians became even more important to this, and the Medes kind of took a backseat. And we do find in history that on that very night when everybody was probably pretty much drunk, that Darius the Mede, who was in charge of the Medo-Persian Empire as it existed at that time, came into Babylon and in fact conquered the Babylonians, just as Daniel had written it. Now that's the story that we read in, as I said, Daniel chapter 5. And I would encourage you to read that, Daniel chapter 5, around verse 1 through, we'll just read the whole chapter. You can get all the background. Now, many historians have read this, and they said, while there are some truths in this, that yes, you have Darius the Mede did conquer, and there was this party and stuff. And they said, but what this passage shows us is that the book of Daniel is a fake. It's a fake because we know from historical writings that Belshazzar was not the king of Babylon at this time. In fact, there's no record of a person named Belshazzar being king. We know that at this particular time, when Babylon was conquered by Darius the Mede, that the name of the king was Nabonidus. And they say, well, right there, we find that what we're reading in Daniel is not historical. That was at least until 1854 AD. In 1854, there were some archaeologists who were digging around, as archaeologists do, the city of Ur. We remember that from Abraham, Ur the Chaldeans. And they discovered what they called the Nabonidus cylinders. These were cylinders that were created by Nabonidus, who was the king of Babylon at this time. What they recorded, however, was some truths that relate to this particular story. And that is that one of the cylinders records a prayer that Nabonidus made for his son to the Babylonian gods. His son's name was Belshazzar. Of course, historians now are saying, well, that's kind of unique. At least we know the name was right, but we still know that he wasn't king until they read a little further. And on the Nabonidus cylinders, Nabonidus was praying for his son, wealth and whatever he wanted to pray for him, that Belshazzar, and he named him as the king of Babylon. And as we read through the cylinders and through the other documents that have been found in archaeology, we find that while Nabonidus was king of Babylon, he was king of Babylon in the sense as an entire empire, but he didn't like to live in Babylon. We read about how he lived in Arabia. He hated Babylon. He wanted to live in Arabia. And when he went to Arabia to live out his life, he left his son, Belshazzar, as the king of Babylon, and that was his title. Of course, those who had come against the book of Daniel say it's historically inaccurate now had to kind of backtrace and say, okay, what Daniel recorded was in fact true. And I find it's interesting that Daniel uses or makes a statement that is very specific related to all this, because it answers the question as to why did Belshazzar say, I will make the person who can interpret this phrase or this miraculously written phrase on the wall third highest in the kingdom. The reason is because he was already second highest in the kingdom. He had the title King of Babylon, but his father was first, he was second. So the best that he could do was to make someone third highest in the kingdom. I always find it interesting when you look deep enough, you look at some of the ancient records and the things that we have found in archaeology. You take some of the passages in the Old Testament, the stories that in themselves are fascinating. You see how all these things kind of coalesce together. What Daniel wrote way back then, before Darius ever attacked the Babylonians, about Belshazzar was, in fact, true to the T. It's interesting what you can find in ancient history. Well, I just want to share that with you. I have a chance to read quite a bit, and in my job, I do a lot of studying and I do writing. So it's kind of interesting you come across some of these little tidbits of history. And I always find it interesting when people will say, hey, you know, this particular book in the Old Testament is wrong. And we know that. But then you wait a little while, an archaeological find comes along, and sure enough, you find that what the Bible recorded was, in fact, true. Anyways, hope you're having a good day. Hope things go well for you. I encourage you to read the story of Belshazzar and think about the background to it. Anyways, you have a blessed day, and I hope you have a great weekend. And I wish you all the best. Take care.